Welcome to Rant World, the conservative podcast with Sam Widener.
Bail reform has become a popular and controversial topic since the death of George Floyd in May of 2020. Today I have bail attorney Ken Good on Rant World to talk about bail reform. How are you, Ken?
I'm great. Thank you very much for having me.
So, Ken, you are more than qualified to talk about this particular topic. Do you care to explain your background to the listeners and what you do?
Sure. I am an attorney. I grew up in Texas. My grandfather was a sharecropper, and my parents were public school teachers. I went to college, went to graduate school, went to law school. I started out practicing law, representing doctors in hospitals. I was on court TV and argued a bunch of appellate cases, and then I was hired by bondsmen for a complicated issue, and we were successful, and word spread. I got hired by more bondsmen, and I got hired by some insurance companies. I'm Texas counsel for several companies. I'm on the board of the Professional Bondsmen of Texas. I'm on the legislative committee. I draft proposed legislation to provide, and we to Texas legislature as proposals. We give white papers for bills that we support and others for those we oppose, and we look out for whatever is good for the criminal justice system is generally good for the bail industry, because we're an integral part of the bail industry. We do one thing: we get people to court. And the problem we're having right now is we're having areas of this country where they feel like they shouldn't care whether somebody comes to court, and we're seeing disastrous consequences when they don't, because they get into other trouble because they think, we won't come to court. And so we are seeing spikes in crime all across the country, generally in our urban areas, where they forgot for a moment the importance about getting people to appear for court.
Well, it seems like you've had a very interesting career in what you do. So the first question I have is, one of the main points that people make when advocating for bail reform is that no one should be detained simply because they are poor and they cannot afford bail, even though eliminating bail will release dangerous criminals back on the street. What is your view on this point?
Well, like in Texas, there's a statute, 1715 of the Texas Code of Criminal Procedure, that sets out several factors for setting bail. And, the problem we have with our friends on the other side is they kind of misrepresent the issues. Because they'll take this, a ruling from the Fifth Circuit, a ruling from the federal court in Harris County, and they'll say, see, these courts have ruled X, and it's usually the opposite of what they've said. They'll say, well, the courts have held that nobody can be held in jail for failing to pay, or not having an ability to pay. In fact, the courts have held the exact opposite. The purpose of bail is to ensure that you will appear for court. It also has a public safety element, also to protect the victims. And so if you take all of those considerations into account and you set your bond, then you have an individual magistration. You've met the requirements of the statute, met the constitutional requirements. And if you can't pay that amount, then you may be stuck in jail, but the constitutional requirements have been met. What our friends have been doing is they're taking bail schedules that have been how our largest urban areas have gotten people processed through the jail quickly and efficiently when they're arrested. And then when someone can't post that bail scheduled amount, the courts have not set up proper procedures to protect the poor. And so when the courts rule that those procedures, like an individual hearing, were not set up to protect the poor, our friends are misrepresenting that the courts have held that you cannot constitutionally detain someone who's poor, where the courts have ruled the opposite. No one has, in the U.S., you do not have a right to release. You have a right to a hearing on bail. The courts have the ability to hold you if they don't think you're going to do what you're supposed to do, pending a resolution of your criminal case. So I think when somebody tells me that poor should not be detained, I would say, first of all, with bail reform where it is right now, there's not anybody that's being held in prison or held in jail solely because they're poor. Right now, after the pandemic, the jails are all full. They're all full of very dangerous people, and they all need to stay there. In fact, we're letting low-level people out because we don't have room for them, and that's the reason why our crime is increasing, because we don't have anywhere to put these people.
Right, and I believe it was the Fifth Circuit that decided about the constitutionality of bail. Is that correct?
Yes, we've had two federal courts of appeals. I think it's the 11th, it's either the 11th or the 10th, and the Fifth Circuit have both held that bail is substantively constitutional, which means it can withstand constitutional review, it can be used, and it is really the cornerstone of our criminal justice system. But what the courts have ruled is if you don't have procedures in place, if you use a bail schedule, and the person doesn't, and someone claiming poverty doesn't have procedures to allow them an individual hearing, then you have procedural due process issues, and your system that you set up violates this procedural due process clause. Well, our friends on the other side take that and say, bail's been held unconstitutional. You can't use bail anymore if they're poor, if they're claiming poverty, and those are not true. And I would say that some of our friends on the other side know that that's not true, and they're intentionally misleading people to try to get to the result they want.
Now, many places has enacted bail reform. Bail reform has been put into place in Alaska, Colorado, Maryland, Washington State, South Carolina, Missouri, Texas, Kentucky, New Jersey, and New York. Now, New Mexico has the Laura and John Arnold risk assessment. Is that correct?
I think they use that as part. I think, there are some people like New Jersey initially did bail reform with a risk assessment as what was going to be the panacea or the cure-all to replace the need for bail bonds. And the problem is all the studies that have come out since then have all said do not use risk assessments. They're not any good, and they also have a racial component to it. And so you've seen a lot of people pull back. Texas hasn't enacted statewide bail reform. I expect it to be in the special session starting in 2 days. Alaska enacted some bail reform, and it's now repealed them. A lot of states that acted early are now coming back and repealing or have already repealed many of the reforms because they have not worked. They have not done. New Jersey did a major reform and pretty much put the bail industry out of business, and their jail makeup is still the same after all these reforms. It's just now the state's paying for everything. So what they were promised and what they got were absolutely two different things, and you're reaping the reward of the harvest. You're harvesting what they misled, because everywhere the bail reform has been tried is mostly in the urban areas, and crime is increasing substantially in the urban areas, and it's all because of these bail reforms that are you want to make sure you protect the poor, but you don't want to tie the hands of the police and the criminal justice system so that the criminals are running the system, which I think that's what we're doing in some of our large urban areas, and that's why you're seeing a reversal, and people are saying we need to hire more cops now instead of defund the cops, because crime is just running amok, and the Democrats are starting to realize that if they don't change quickly, they're going to get massacred in an election in a year.
So with many of the states that have enacted bail reform, many of them report having higher crime and more tendency to failure to appear. But with that, New York enacted bail reform laws in 2019, and the NYPD reports a 15.6% rearrest rate for those released due to bail reform in 2019 and 14% rearrest rate in 2020, with less arrests being made in 2020. And with that, there are conflicting scholarly articles about the New York bail reform system. With your experience, bail reform, you obviously think, is not the best thing for states to do. But with your experience, what would you say to the legislators that enacted the New York bail reform laws?
I would say, well, thank you, first of all, for the New York legislators who recognized very quickly, within months after the New York bail reform went into effect, even during the middle of the pandemic, they repealed large parts of it because crime was increasing. And the problem is we still have large parts in effect, or we still have some parts of it in effect. Crime has continued to increase greatly. The problem that we're having with our friends on the other side is, they're recognizing that crime is increasing, but they don't want to admit that it's bail reform. What would I tell legislators? You know what? I would say there are four types of release that have been attempted historically in the United States. We've got preventive detention, which is the opposite of release. We just hold them. And we want to hold as few people as possible. We want to hold the really dangerous people because those are the people that you just shouldn't be out of jail. And we have very strict limitations in Texas under the Texas Constitution on who can be held. And then the other ways is how do we process large numbers of people through the urban area jails where we have a crime problem going on right now. What's been tried is individual magistration. That meets all the constitutional requirements. The problem is it's very expensive. And there's just not enough time unless you hire a large number of people or magistrates to do it. And you're spending all your money at the very beginning of the criminal justice system instead of where you need it to get cases through the system. The other things that have been tried, like this risk assessment that we've already kind of touched upon. It was supposed to be the thing that with science, it's going to replace bondsmen. It's a failure. And everything else is just shown that it no longer be used. The largest digital companies in the world issued a press release saying it should not be part of bail reform. And then you've got what New York and what Harris County has tried, and that's just simple release. Well, we're going to release you with no bond like in New York, or in Harris County, we're going to release you on a $100 PR bond. As long as it's just a misdemeanor, as long you never even see a magistrate, blah, blah, blah. So there's no gatekeeper. The problem with simple release, that's what you're seeing. And then you have what have been tried as a bail schedule. And bail schedules allows large numbers of people to be released if they can post the bond amount set out on the schedule. The ones that can't, the magistrates can focus their discretion on the people that are left. The problem we have is our friends on the other side have attacked the use of bail schedules, and they're arguing to replace them with simple release. Simple release is an unmitigated disaster, an absolute failure everywhere it's been tried. Risk assessments, science says don't use them. Largest digital companies says don't use them. So what does that leave us? Individual magistration coupled with preventive detention. That's fine, but that doesn't give an out for our largest urban areas. So you've got to go back to what's been used and what has been shown to work, and that's the use of a bail schedule coupled with statutory procedures to protect the poor, which is the reason why we got sued to begin with. So that if someone is claiming poverty, they will have procedures in place that meet the constitutional requirements. And once you do all that, then that's what I would call good bail reform. What we're having enacted everywhere is bad bail reform, which is allowing the criminals to run the criminal justice system in our large urban areas, and it's leading to chaos, increased crime, and it will continue to do that until we change course.
Okay, so now many of the high-end politicians, I guess you would say, have expressed their opinions on bail reform.
Sure.
For example, former President Donald Trump kind of bashed the New York bail reform policies, and then the New Mexico Republican governor expressed her concerns. And then there are presidential candidates from the 2020 election, such as Joe Biden, who says we should change or reform it. And then, of course, there are those such as Bernie Sanders, who says we should get rid of bail altogether.
Sure.
We know that if we get rid of bail completely, we will have the opportunity to release dangerous criminals back onto the street. And many of the facts I actually got today was from the Professional Bondsmen of Texas website. Especially the New Mexico governor's fact.
Mm-hmm.
And after the death of George Floyd, the Minnesota Freedom Fund, which is, I guess, one of the bigger funds with bail, reported an increase between $35 and $40 million in donations. And those were intended to bail out those who were involved in the protest. But only a small portion of those were to do so. In fact, the Minnesota Freedom Fund, who is backed by Vice President Kamala Harris, was used to bail out a suspect who shot at police, a woman accused of killing her friend, and a twice convicted sex offender. With that being said, how can people trust these nonprofits and companies that they will do the moral thing as far as who to bail out?
Well, to answer the last question first, I'd say you can't. And I would say the reason why is you look at all the examples given, and the overriding theme of all that is politics is coming to impact criminal justice decisions. And that they always do, but I mean, we're having high-profile, polarizing politics affect criminal justice. And so you've got Joe Biden saying that we need to have criminal justice reform. We have to defund the police even. Now he's a year and a half later, he's now saying that cities should use, municipalities should use some of the federal funds to get and hire more police. I would argue that's because the politics, the polling data is not looking good for them for next year. In Texas, we have politicians running away from the defund the police movement, saying that we're not in support of defunding the police. That's probably because Texas has always been a conservative state, even when it was a Democrat state. And so it's hard for Democrats to run in Texas because to raise funds, they have to skew left. But Texas is not a left state, even when the Democrats were in charge. So I think when you get to the Freedom Fund and other bail funds, those are now large pots of money looking for, they're a solution looking for a problem. Because the reason why they raised all that money is they were told we have citizens being arrested that are going to be held in jail they can't afford to be bonded out because they don't have any money. So we need your money immediately. And people responded. The problem is probably 99% of those people were released without a bond, and most of them, if not all of them, had their charge dropped, especially in that area. So you've got these freedom funds or these bail funds that now have large sums of money, and because of the push for bail reform, low-level misdemeanors, first-time offenders are not being held in jail now. We don't have the room for them, and so we have. So what do? I keep challenging these bail funds. They should be looking for people that are currently in jail and bonding them out and almost doing a civil service triage on them. Why are you not functioning in society? What can we do to help you? They have the funds. Train them, giving them training, sending them to drug rehab, getting them off drugs, and make them productive citizens. Start small. They would become would become things that everybody across the political spectrum would look up to and give praise to. But they're not doing that. They're looking still to just bond out some people, and we've got now corruption playing, and they've got all this money and nothing to do with it, and so they're doing other things with it, which is giving a backlash to them. And so I think that, like in Texas, we have a special session. One of the bills that I anticipate will be considered is to put some restrictions on bail funds, and it's really just a question of transparency. And some of the bail funds came in and testified and said, well, why should we be treated differently than, a bonding company? We would love for you to be treated the same as a bonding company. We have to go through an application process. We get scrutinized heavily. We have to put up money with the county. Every county where you're licensed, you put up a $50,000 CD at least, or property for $50,000 in each county in Texas. So, I mean, we love for these bail funds that want to operate in Texas to be held to the same standard, but they're not. They just want transparency. And so I think that some reasonable amount of transparency is good. It's good for the system. It's good for people trusting bail funds. And so I don't think that they should be opposing those, because when you do, then it makes it look like they have something to hide. And so that causes distrust even more.
Now, how do these bail companies and freedom funds choose who they are going to bail out? I know, like you had said, they can donate all this money to helping people with rehab and things such as that nature. But how do they figure out who they are going to bail out?
Well, in Texas, that's probably the best thing. I mean, think of it as you have a family member that gets arrested. You look in the yellow pages. Do a Google search, do a Bing search. You look for bonding companies in a specific city. You may get a call from a bonding company saying, "Hey, your loved one's been arrested. Do you need help bonding them out of jail?" Or they get into jail and they're making their phone call, and they're calling a bonding company. Like in Texas, when you get arrested, there would be a list of bondsmen at the desk where you're put into the jail. And when you give a phone call, you can, or once you're booked into the jail, you can make a phone call and reach out to a bondsman or a family member to start the process. Bondsmen are not allowed to solicit in the jail in large parts of Texas. And so I don't really know how bail funds find people to bond out of the jail, but I have a feeling it's a similar process. Someone who can't get out of the jail otherwise, and they're reaching out to a bail fund through probably a Google search, and they're asking for assistance.
Now, we've talked about the Minnesota Freedom Fund quite a bit. Is there any other freedom funds out there that are popular with bailing people out?
Well, I think there's a bunch of them right at the moment, and the problem that I foresee with bail funds is, they were set up for a specific purpose. They never were used for that purpose. Some of them have been around a lot longer than that, but they've never been widely used. And so now they're flush with cash, but they don't know how. They don't realize what bonding companies do. I mean, they don't have the ability to go look for somebody when they don't show up for court. They don't really have a system in place to remind people to go to court. They don't have a system in place to have them check in with the bail fund because they don't know what the process is. And so, it's well intentioned, but it can't do very much of what a bonding company actually does do under the law, because we're giving special authority to do certain things because we're recognized as a key component of the criminal justice system. We can do more than even the PR personal recognizance bonds departments can do, because we can actually get a warrant and then we can go looking for somebody with that warrant. Even a government agency, when a warrant's issued, it just goes down to the warrant department and joins the tens of thousands of other warrants waiting to be served. A bail fund can't even do that. They can't seek a warrant. So really all they're doing is filing cash, and they're filing cash with the county, saying the full amount of the bond, saying this person, we're bonding them out, and if they fulfill all their obligations, then we'll get our cash back. If they don't, then the cash will be forfeited to the state or to county.
And the last question that I have, and we've touched base on this a little bit, but like I said, the Minnesota Freedom Fund made between $35 and $40 million after the death of George Floyd, intended to bail out people who were involved in protests. If the Freedom Fund does not use that money, what happens to the donations that are made?
Well, there were some people that came back and said they'd like to have their money back, and they did not get it back. These funds are opaque currently. They're not required to report even who gave them money in most situations, because that's a First Amendment right of free association. That's part of the danger of these bail funds. Organized crime is running amok during bail reform because they're the criminals that are running the criminal justice system. They're the ones taking advantage of the rules that are being set up by people to make sure we don't take advantage of the poor, but we're allowing a system to be set up that's being taken advantage of by the criminal justice system. So I think that you don't want to set up no oversight so that even the organized crime can set up bail funds. What happens to that money? That's one of the reasons why I keep challenging these bail funds that have lots of money to identify people, triage them, find out why they're not being productive in society, and address those needs. They can do that. Maybe not on the large scale they want, but they can find out what works, grow, because the reality is, we've already had one or two or more bail funds where the leader or the organizational leader has withdrawn or resigned because of mismanagement or taking advantage of these large sums of money. I'm afraid that will continue if the money just sits there, because it's a solution now that's looking for a problem, because the problem that arose when the money was contributed didn't turn out to be a real problem, and they're now looking for a problem for all that solution they already have.
Well, I think that covers all the questions I've had. Thank you so much for coming on Rant World. This, I think, has been the longest episode I've ever published. And thank you for giving me your time.
Hey, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. This is an issue that's very important to me. These issues are very important to, I think, criminal justice as well. We all have to recognize what works, and we all have to also recognize what doesn't work. I think part of the problem right now is, our friends on the other side recognize that crime is increasing, but they don't want to admit that what's not working is many of these reforms that they've pushed and they've said would work and have not. And so we've got, I think that's why I think so well of New York. Their politicians recognized very quickly that the reforms they were not working, and they repealed many of them. They just have more to repeal because crime is, I think there was a report out over the weekend about how dramatic crime is up again in New York. So we still have lots to do. We always want to set up procedures to protect the poor, but we also don't want to set up a system that allows the criminals to take advantage of the criminal justice system. That's what's taking place right now, and we have to identify it, stop it, repeal it, and hold them accountable. And thank you for having me.
All right, thank you, Ken. This has truly been a very informative episode, and I can't wait to talk to you soon.
Okay, thanks, sir.